and just do some heart math. Oh, there's Nita. She's here. All right, so coming into comfortable position. And your eyes can be closed or have a soft gaze, whatever feels best. And turn your attention to your breath. And the process always begins with Svadhyaya, just seeing yourself, those first steps of self-awareness. As you become your own witness in a very gentle, unbiased way. And just begin to observe the flow of breath in and out. See if you can allow that to happen through the nose. And you feel the sensation and movement of breath within your system. The expansion on the inhalation, the gentle contraction on the exhalation. Perhaps feeling more specifically as you inhale, the movement of the lower rib cage as the diaphragm moves down, helping the chest to expand and open, and the gentle toning of the abdominal muscles as you exhale. The diaphragm domes up. Deepening your awareness as you begin to just withdraw your senses a little more from the outside and bringing them within. And tuning your awareness into your heart. Begin just by witnessing, just by being present. And as you sense into your heart, begin to feel as if the heart could breathe. So as you inhale, the diaphragm moves down and the heart stretches open in all directions. And as you exhale, the diaphragm domes up. And there's a gentle contraction of tissue around the heart. Expanding and releasing. And as you tune into your heart, asking your heart, what does it need? What will support you in this moment? And then create an image of that which gives you that felt sense that will support and feed the heart. And as you see it, really try to breathe in the feeling into the heart center. And staying with it for one more full breath. And when you're ready, in your own time, just opening your eyes. So thank you everyone for being here. And always beginning class with HeartMath with me. So tonight we're going to round out our module about muscles and intelligent sequencing. Some of the logistical things that I will say are that when I send the email tomorrow that has this recording, this muscles email will then be complete. So it'll have all the, pre-recorded lectures. It'll have all the lectures that have been recordings like this. It'll have all the handouts. And so what I recommend to those of you that are here with me tonight, or if you're watching this as a recording, is that before you start Bones lecture, or the next module, which is our last module, which is Bones, you're going to receive that email towards the end of the week to just really take your time. Go through this final email, make sure you're caught up, make sure you've printed the handouts. It's really good to create an organized notebook for yourself of this information, and then move on to our final module, which will be Bones. Okay, so let's begin this lecture. And tonight we are talking about strength. We're going to talk about a lot of things, but we're going to really use the learning about strength as sort of a window into muscles a little more. Okay. Hold on one second. So before I start, is the Zoom window blocking the slides?
I can see the slides.
Okay, good. All right. So the first question that I'll start with is, how do we measure strength and increases in strength? And there's a very clear sort of metric understanding of how we measure strength in the body. And it's the ability to produce force to overcome or move load. The ability to produce force to overcome or move load. And so why I have these two images here is in this yoga pose, this person doing Vashisthasana is overcoming the load of both gravity and their own physical weight in this very specific way through their body, or the person, with weights really generating enough force against external load. So load can come in the form of our own bodies, and it can come externally. So if we're seeking the benefits of strength, it's important to understand what actually contributes to gaining strength. And there's a lot of misconceptions about what physical strength is. And what we can say is that many things constitute fitness. And fitness is a very broad term, which encompasses many things, such as a feeling of strength, mobility, agility, endurance. There's all these different components. But what we're really looking at and talking about tonight is the science of strength and what actually makes you stronger. Okay. And so to talk about that, we have to take a moment and look at the nervous system. And please, someone just tell me if you need me to move the Zoom pictures, okay? So the nervous system is, we can divide our nervous system into sort of two main components. And if you guys go on with me into 300-hour learning, we break down a lot more. But the two main areas of the nervous system are first the central nervous system. And the central nervous system here you can see in pink, and it's called the central nervous system because it truly is within the center of the body, and it's the brain and the spinal cord. That is what the central nervous system is. And then we have the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is all the nerves in yellow, and they're the nerves that extend out from the spinal cord to the rest of the body. We have this sutra. Well, let me say this first. The first thing, and we're going to really break down what this sentence means, is that strength, and we can say strength in yoga really equates to the concept of sthira, stability, strength, is an outcome of many different adaptations. And so what does it mean to adapt to something? And to adapt to something means something that we are exposed to again and again and again and again that will create changes within us. And this very much, when we understand that strength is a culmination of different adaptations, that only occurs when it is, like this sutra, done for a long time, without break, with sincere devotion, that adaptations become firmly rooted, stable, and a solid foundation. And so this is very true for strength. We can't go, and there's different ways to gain strength, but as one example, we can't go to the gym one day and lift weights and then have created the adaptations that we may be looking for to be measurably stronger. It takes consistency for these adaptations to take place. And it's just amazing to me how much was seen and understood with, in these ancient texts of yoga around these like just very true facts of well-being and anatomy and the brain and the nervous system. So first we're going to talk about adaptations that contribute to strength in the central nervous system. So here we're talking about the brain and the spinal cord. And all central nervous system adaptations take about 8 to 12 weeks of consecutive training to integrate. So training ourselves multiple times over 2 to 3 months is when you will really start to see the increase of these adaptations within our system. Number one is coordination. And so coordination is about the quality of movement and not quantity. And this is where cueing or coaching become really important. And coordination first begins with external focus and is supported with external cueing. So we've talked about that in other lectures, and that has to do more with proprioception. People first understand when you tell them to reach the crown of their head towards the sky, root their feet towards the earth. You're giving them an external cue how to orient themselves in space. And then internal cueing, more somatic internal experience, draw the low belly back towards the spine kind of cueing, is where we begin to really like refine coordination. So it's something to consider depending on the population that you're working with and their experience in terms of the type of cueing you're going to begin with. So coordination is adaptation in proprioception and brain-body connection. And coordination is not just about the areas that are moving, but it's very much about what is not moving and creating stability, right? So the example would be like not using momentum, right? The ability, let's say you're moving. A simple example would be like a bicep curl. What you'll see people doing at the gym a lot of times is a bicep curl that looks like this. And there's a lot of momentum that's being generated to create that movement, where for somebody to actually create that same movement without momentum and to maintain using the same amount of weight and maintain the stability every place else. So that would really be the only joint and muscle that was being activated for the movement, requires a whole new level of coordination and of stability. We can think about that here. In poses like Utkatasana, right? So Utkatasana is a pose that I go back to a lot. And the coordination of being able to go into this pose with a stacked core canister. It's very difficult. And so it requires a high level of coordination, not just what is moving, but what is not moving. Another really powerful example, chaturanga. When you have gravity coming in, and to maintain long spine, the natural curves of the spine, which we'll talk about as we get into bones, and a stacked core canister requires a high level of coordination and strength. Okay. Next, another point I want to say is that how we build coordination has to do with using similar conditions and load. And so what I mean by that is that, you would want to practice Utkatasana in the same way for that period of time. You wouldn't want within a couple of weeks to make the foundation less stable, start practicing it on a ball, start using weights as you practiced it. If you change conditions and you change load, you're not necessarily going to adapt the quality of coordination until you've created those adaptations, until you've gone through that building process. And once you've gone through that building process and you now have that quality of coordination in movement, then you can begin to challenge the conditions and you can begin to challenge the load. Okay, so next, we're going to talk about, stop share here for a second. Next, we're going to talk about what's called antagonist co-activation. And this is not something that we consciously control. So anytime you concentrically contract, right, the agonist fires, And then there's always co-activation of the antagonist, the opposing muscle. This is a lot what we were working on in the last class when we were all together. So surprisingly though, when you contract your bicep, I want everyone to take a moment and contract their biceps. So bend the elbow, feel. But as you do that, I want you to feel your tricep, feel the back of the arm. And so you'll feel there is some activation that happens in the tricep as you activate your bicep. And healthy co-activation of the agonist causes the antagonist to activate a bit to create stability across the joint. Okay. And so once you start strengthening the agonist, the antagonist will fire less. I know it's a little confusing, but what happens is that it will let go more and not pull as much, creating less internal resistance and not fighting the agonist as much. And this is information that we're constantly informing our systems in asana. So before I go on with that, I feel like it's a bit of a confusing concept. I want to know, is that landing, and does anybody have any questions about that?
I was gonna ask if you could say that again of
Yeah.
like
I'll read my notes.
okay, okay.
That's it. So it's called antagonist co-activation. It's not something that we consciously control. So anytime you concentrically contract and the agonist fires, there is co-activation of the antagonist. A healthy co-activation of agonist and antagonist creates stability across a joint. And we can understand that. Once you start strengthening an agonist, you're training a specific muscle, the antagonist will fire less. It will let go more. And it won't pull as much, creating less internal resistance and not fighting the agonist as much. And this type of information is something that we are consistently informing our bodies with asana. And so let me give you an example. Utkatasana. Okay, so in Utkatasana, our hamstrings, as we're sitting back, are in concentric contraction. Everybody remember that? They are shortening. And our quads, the muscles in the front of the thigh, they are lengthening in eccentric contraction. Now, when someone's hamstrings are unconditioned and that whole complex is not very strong, the hamstrings will fire as they sit back, but the quads will pull a lot. The more conditioned people become, the hamstrings will fire and the quads will eccentrically lengthen and release more. When someone is not as conditioned, their muscles aren't as strong and as informed, that pulling of the quads in Utkatasana creates a lot of internal resistance. Is that making sense? Yeah? Questions? No? Okay. So.
Okay, wait, actually, sorry. I was trying to unmute myself, but I was having a hard time. Okay, can I just say it? Tell me if this is incorrect. I'm trying to say it in like simple terms, essentially. With the antagonist co-activation, that essentially means that there will be less resistance ultimately between the muscles, right? Is
Yeah.
is like when that's activated, it's
It-
more of a
Yes.
that release.
The concentric contraction becomes clearer and the eccentric becomes longer.
Okay, okay,
Yeah, and
cool.
so, and it's not like trying so hard to
Yeah.
maintain stability around the joint, and that trying that is very informed by the nervous system creates a lot of internal resistance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay,
Lauren, can I ask one more quick question in regards to that too?
please.
So on the agonist also with I'll just say becoming more stable and strong for the agonist, is
Mhm.
that causing the joint to in turn be more stable? That's the reason the antagonist can back off a little bit extra at the same time.
I say it one more time. Let me hear. Let me. So
Okay.
is the
So I'm saying with the agonist, like
yeah.
if we make our biceps, we work our biceps a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Our bicep becomes larger and more stable.
Yes.
Then the antagonist, the tricep, will be backing off more so and not firing as much. Am I correct at this point?
Yep. You are.
So with that being the case, is the
Oh,
bicep
okay. Wait. I wouldn't say it's not going to be firing as much.
okay?
Be lengthening more easily. So in eccentric contraction, there still is a firing. Go on. Does that
Okay,
make
so there's still a fire, but is the fire okay? That's my question then. Is the fire as significant as it was when the bicep was smaller at that point? Let's start there.
I think that it has to do with the quality of eccentric. And so eccentric is the ability for a muscle to fire and lengthen simultaneously. So
Okay.
the muscle, the antagonist has ability to be strong at longer and longer lengths.
Okay, and then at that point, it's causing the joint itself to be more stable at that point also.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we're getting fine tuned
I
about it, but it
I was
is
gonna say I'm kind of going in the woods a little
understanding.
bit, but I get it.
Yeah, because with eccentric, the muscle is still firing. It's
Mhm.
just that the resistance overcomes its ability to shorten. So it lengthens, but it's still firing. It's still trying to shorten, but it lengthens, and it lengthens in a more comfortable, adaptable way.
Gotcha. That's what I need a whole bunch more of.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, and that's, truly one of the beautiful things about yoga is that it does educate our system in that way,
Thank you.
where a lot of other forms of movement don't necessarily. It teaches our body to become more stable in eccentric contraction. Yeah. Okay. So, and that brings me to the concept of that resistance can live within and without the body. It can be in the body and outside the body. And so, like a pose like this, here someone is just lifting their legs, right? And for many of us, perhaps this might seem like a simple pose, but for most of the population that sits in a chair all day with their knees bent, um, there is a ton of resistance through the entire back line of the body. We could just think about it, that resistance being in the hamstrings, but that resistance could be at the sole of the feet, the quads, the hamstrings, all across the back, so that for somebody to lift their legs, all kinds of things can happen. Let's where first of all, lifting the legs might be very hard to have straight legs because there's so much resistance through this back line. And the other thing too that happens when people lift their legs is a lot of extension in the back because of the tension all across that whole back line of musculature and fascia. And so that's internal resistance opposed to external resistance. And the truth is that it just seems not always the case, but very, very generally, men morphologically seem to have more internal resistance in terms of their muscle and fascia, right? And we see that. Not always. So resistance can come within or without, and the resistance without would be gravity.
Is there a purpose why, sorry, is there a purpose why men have more resistance internally and why women don't? I mean, or like, what's the reasoning behind it? Do we
Answer for
know?
that, except for perhaps how men build muscle tissue a little more easily.
Mm.
But I don't have an answer for that, but it's a good question. And I think let's look into it.
Yeah.
Certainly
Cool.
something, I mean, it's just something, and I can't say like, I know that for sure, but having been a body worker now for 25 years and having touched, thousands of people, like
Sure.
men are just tend to be stiffer, tighter, their tissue feels different. And, and I see it in yoga a lot.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
And so we could look at these sort of two, and I didn't choose a man or a woman here for any particular reason, but here we're looking at like internal resistance versus the opposite, which would be hypermobility, right? And so here we see a man trying Janu-Sirsasana, and you see all that internal resistance that obviously is in the backs of his legs, his hips, his back, and it's causing him this is the shape he's capable of making because of the internal resistance that's in his body. And so what we have to do in that situation to support him is prop him, right? He needs a lot of props. He needs his pelvis lifted up off the earth. He needs encouragement perhaps to keep the knee of the straight leg bent so that he can even begin to find some length in his spine. And the opposite is someone who lacks resistance in their body. And this really occurs obviously with excessive hypermobility and flexibility, where the fascia becomes floppy and it doesn't create those barriers. And who of these two sort of opposing qualities do you think is your student that is prone more for injury?
Mobile.
Hypermobile. I will take people with internal resistance all day long in terms of thinking that their bodies keep them because it's the joints that are most at risk. And so people with internal resistance, they hold themselves together. It's hypermobile people that, and they have a harder time also knowing where their bodies are in space, where that resistance gives you a lot of sensory feedback. For hypermobility, you have a lot less sensory feedback. Just to even know that perhaps you're in a hypermobile position. Okay, and from all of this, what we would say is that Oops, what happened? Sorry. Is that the spine is queen or king, whichever you want to say. And so we want to look at what's happening in the joints, but we're always like bowing to the spine. And so to make something safe, always allow the limbs to have softness, the joints to have a soft bend, to keep finding in yoga the length of the spine. All right. And that always has to be supported by the core canister and intra-abdominal pressure that we've talked about. Okay. So excess flexibility without a match point of concentric contraction can cause too much lengthening to arrive in the tendons and ligaments, making joints increasingly unstable. And just as I said before, excessive flexibility is potentially more dangerous than excessive rigidity. The other place that we just want to, and this really ties into the antagonist coactivation that we want to be careful with, is with binding. Because binding can possibly override the antagonist. And so can anyone look at these poses and tell me at what place and why? And I know this is a trick question, it's not easy. Where can antagonist override be happening here and why?
The hips? No?
Yeah, you could say the hips. Okay, tell me why. It's a tricky
I
one.
I just know for myself, I'm extremely flexible, and I popped my groin, I guess, it like snapped, and that, and I have a hard time getting up in Bird of Paradise, so that just makes me look at that.
Okay, right.
I think the hips, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Not,
So when we look in that Bird of Paradise pose, let's look at the upper leg, the lifted leg. What joint actions are happening with that lifted leg? Anybody?
It's an extension from the quad being concentrically contracted.
Well, you have, what I would say is, yes, the quad would be concentric, but at the same time, you have abduction, right? And you have external rotation. And a lot of that is happening from the back of the leg, the glutes and the deep six are creating that external rotation through the back. And so that adductors are in eccentric. You guys following me?
Mhm.
So the muscles that would pull the legs back together there, that one is lengthened. And now you're putting all this pressure against that eccentric. That eccentric is lengthening, and now you're putting pressure to continue back. And you're overriding that quality of its intelligence. Does that make sense? There's a point at which if you didn't have your arms wrapped around your leg, that your leg would only do so much. But now that you're putting pressure of the arm pushing back, it might do more than what is really available. The place that's a little more obvious to me in both of these poses is the front of the shoulder of both of these, right? Because here, essentially, you're bringing your arm into extension. It doesn't look like it because it's coming forward. But the movement of the arm, that the top arm that's in the bind, it's an extension. It's going back. Right? But you're binding, everybody like want to feel that to a certain extent. So feel how it's really the back of the arm that is contracting, that's creating extension, those posterior delt, the lat. And so it's the front of the shoulder, that anterior delt, that would be an eccentric, but it would also have all this force coming into it. And it could potentially lengthen too much and create instability in the joint. And it's just something you always just want to watch for in your own practice and other people's practices, that to let go of that there's some place to be. There's no place to be. The place to be is sthira sukha. The place to be is balanced and in the middle in the experience in your body, which means that the joints themselves too have a place of what's called right action and of middle, and that we're not overriding.
Can I ask a question? I know I've been asking a lot of questions.
I want you to, please ask.
Okay. Okay, so what would be the agonist in the first picture pose with the bind behind the back? I see the shoulder. That's initially what I thought of, like, oh, that has the possibility of being overridden right there. But what would be can we label what the agonist and what the antagonist is?
Which joint are you talking about?
Oh, sorry. The first pose, the male pose.
Okay, top shoulder.
Yeah.
Okay, so to me, I see the bottom shoulder having more force coming into it because the leg is pushing against that upper arm bone.
Oh, I see. Okay. I
Go on.
I immediately, well, I think I just from my own bodily experience, binds are super hard for me because my shoulders get super spicy, funky, like my top shoulder. In that pose specifically, my top shoulder would be struggling.
Sure. And so, I mean, I don't have an answer for that. I'd have to see what you were doing or why, and we'd probably have to know a lot more about your shoulder
Yeah, sure.
to understand why that might be more. But my point with these pictures really are that where is, and sure, I mean, with that top shoulder too, you're asking, you're reaching and placing force across a joint in a way that antagonist co-activation doesn't have its same inherent intelligence. That's really my point.
I
So-
see.
Yeah.
Okay, so what would be, can we label, like, in that situation, could we label the antagonist and the agonist?
So in that situation with the top shoulder, the agonist is the back of the shoulder.
Okay.
Antagonist is the front. That's what's lengthening,
Oh, I see. Okay.
right?
Cool.
Everyone see that? Okay,
Cool. Thank you.
you're welcome. All right, so now let's talk about Trikonasana. So when we transition in and out of a posture, it's also important to recognize where resistance is coming from and how to best overcome it so as not to collapse. All right, so there's so many places resistance could come in from within and from without. So let's just start to take a stab at it. Where in this pose might be a place that you feel resistance, you've seen the quality of resistance that causes this pose to lose the support of the spine, right? The spine is queen, and experience collapse. Any thoughts?
The,
In the obliques, maybe?
yeah,
Okay, why? And what would that look like? And who should
I-
I?
well, because if I don't keep my core super tight and I just go all the way down to all the way down to my bottom hand all the way down to the floor. If I engage my core, I have to bring my hand up a little bit more, otherwise I'm collapsing.
So you will have a lot of lateral flexion, you're saying, like one side of your body. So I'm going to mimic these things that you guys are saying to me. What I hear you saying, Zach, is that if you, and I might not be able to do it like you do it, but when you come into Trikonasana, if you don't engage, then you'll have a lot of drop. Is that
Yeah,
what-
like I'm engaging my core right now, but if I just go into it, I can go all the way down and it's not really. So,
More like that?
yeah, like if I'm not engaged right now, I don't know if you can see me. I don't know how close
I can't really see you. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so
So where,
like if I engage my core, I kind of stop here. But if I don't, I can just fold all the way over. That's
Okay.
like abs.
so where, let's talk about resistance. That's a really good example. And this is kind of what I'm understanding. She doesn't engage her core, then whoop, she's all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
Where is resistance coming from? There.
Um,
Internal or is it external?
external?
External,
Yeah,
right? She doesn't have a lot of internal resistance
yeah.
happening, so she has more external resistance coming into her system. And so for her not to collapse, what does she have to do more so? You're saying engage core, but I want you to think about it in terms of this internal external concept. Because engaging core won't quite get you there. You have to.
Lengthen the spine.
You do.
Well,
But to do so, you would have to resist gravity,
oh, yeah.
right?
That's a question too. I didn't even think of that.
So here we go. Gravity. Whoop. Resist. I am pushing back up to create more length and allow the spine.
Okay, I got that.
And then from there, then there's the refining of, there's the refining of like what's really happening in my core now. Am I, have anterior tilt in my pelvis? Do I have posterior tilt in the pelvis? Once you've resisted gravity, then you can work on creating a strong core canister.
My ass is always out, so I'm working on that.
Yeah, so finding what a balanced core canister in that direction of gravity would mean for you. All right, now what would possibly internal resistance could look like, and where could it come from in that pose? Anybody? I'll pull the pose back up on the screen.
Like trying to squeeze your legs together, that internal between the floor and your own legs, I guess.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I guess that's you generating something, right? You're
Mhm.
talking about like generating a muscular action. But
Yeah.
what if you have like super tight
Is it like the stretch of your hips and
Mm.
along the spine? Or
what
not
if you
along the
have
spine?
really super tight adductors? See
Yeah.
those
Mm.
yellow muscles there? Just that for a lot of people, they're tight, they'll get to here and they're just like, oh, like moving all around that because it's so tight here. That's the internal resistance. And that might be someone you give a block to, you help them soften their knee, and then they can find more length in their spine. Where if they get here, there's so much tightness here, it's just gonna pull everything in.
So sometimes I see a lot of, would it be like hypermobility when the shoulder, I feel like goes like, you see almost, yeah, like a collapse in that space. Would that be lack of internal resistance?
Not necessarily. I think a lot of times that really just has to do with proprioception. And people
Sure. Okay.
not knowing where the twist, because Trikonasana is also a twist, where the rotation comes from. And that also speaks to my block that, oh wait, I had a point and I just lost it. That that speaks to the spine. So people are often looking for more rotation, thinking by bringing their arm back that that's how they've created more rotation, right? Where helping people to understand that the rotation is only available in the spine and what it means to have balanced joint space, and over time, helping people just find that. But a lot of people will anteriorly tilt the pelvis, come into a lot of extension, and look for a lot more rotation by reaching the arm further back.
Okay, so then I assume then more internal resistance would be needed in that core canister, right? To bring that back to neutral and create the rotation from the spine instead.
Yes.
Okay.
And there can always be a mix of a couple things going on. It's not always necessarily one thing or another, but these are things you can begin to use for observation and different body types and what's going on and how to support people. Okay. All right.
Hey, Lauren. So, well, the word just escaped you, but you said that, when you're in that twist, that gravity was the external, was it limitation? External,
In the twist.
you asked Zach,
Oh,
what was,
Zach. Okay, for Zach, yeah, that what was making her drop down was gravity. That was the quality resistance coming into her body.
the
She
resist?
had to oppose that. She
Okay.
didn't
So,
have much resistance. It's just gravity.
right. So for external resistance, it would be gravity or like weights placed upon you. That would
Exactly.
be it.
Yes.
Okay.
Gravity and load.
Okay.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the third adaptation, which is agonist activation. So let's just remember that the central nervous system sends a signal from the brain via a motor neuron that innervates a muscle fiber and it tells that muscle fiber to fire, right? And this command is on or off. There isn't like sort of a command or a little bit of a command or a little bit of a muscle fiber activation. It's either activated or not. And it's called the all or none principle. And so there's no such thing as a stronger motor command. The only way to get more force out of your muscles is to get more motor neurons to activate. Okay? And so a motor pool consists of many motor neurons which innervate a motor unit within a muscle. Okay, so we just want more and more motor units to activate for the full muscle to have the potential for its strongest contraction. Now, very amazingly, is we have something called neural drive. And neural drive has to do with perception and the mind. And at the level of the central nervous system, the brain, perception really plays into how many motor units fire. And so as you perceive something to be more challenging, you will recruit more motor units. And the perception of the mind regarding motor units refers to our conscious awareness of effort involved in a movement, which is directly linked to the number of motor units being recruited by the brain to generate that movement. Essentially, the more motor units activated, the greater perceived effort and the stronger the muscle contraction. So have you ever gone to lift something and you thought it was going to be really heavy and it was really light and you were like, whoa, your brain just was like, wait, I wasn't thinking that's what was going to happen. And it had to do with the fact that you perceived it to be much heavier than it was. And then a lot more force came into the experience. And this is a very subjective process. It plays into motivation and stress and purpose and coaching. And this is an adaptive process. And so once we adapt and something is no longer perceivably as difficult, we are no longer strength training that particular adaptation. So our mind has to perceive difficulty, right? So if you go to the gym and lifting 220-pound weights is heavy and hard for you at first, when you go, your brain is gonna really kind of connect to the effort that has to be put out. But eventually, once you adapt and those 20 pounds don't really seem that heavy, you're not working that same experience and that same adaptation. And you have to keep raising the load and the difficulty. So let's talk about central nervous system fatigue. So when that sets in, our coordination and efficiency declines and motor units become less able to turn on. And this is where we perceive max effort has been reached. And this is different than muscle fatigue. However, it can be really difficult to distinguish. And once fatigue sets in, we have to rest. And this is where the more is better concept really doesn't hold up. Once you're at max effort and you've hit that line, then you're no longer recruiting high threshold motor units and you're no longer building strength. And so training methodology is really important. And the 3 cues that motor units are dropping off and no longer able to fire is that your speed will slow down dramatically, your range of motion will shorten, and your technique will break down. And when motor units drop off, you are at higher risk for injury, and especially when it's coupled with complex and fast movements.
Like just getting sloppy.
And sloppy. But if we
I feel
break it down, these are the things that make us begin to get sloppy. And it's because motor units are falling off.
that makes sense.
Okay. All right. So now let's talk about muscle metabolism and Agni. So in Ayurveda, we've talked about Agni before, we'll go a little deeper right now. In Ayurveda, Agni is a Sanskrit term that refers to digestive fire, or the biological force that governs digestion and metabolism. And so Agni influences our digestion, our ability to break down food into smaller components that can be absorbed. It influences our metabolism, how we convert nutrients into energy and other essential substances, our ability to detoxify, so how we eliminate metabolic waste and toxins from the body, our immunity by supporting the immune system and maintaining healthy tissue and eliminating pathogens, and our mental clarity. So it influences cognitive function and emotional health. And Agni is a fundamental concept in Ayurveda and yoga and is critically important to overall health. When balanced, Agni represents the root of a healthy life. However, if Agni is deranged or imbalanced, it can contribute to disease. And so the ability to metabolize and assimilate not only food, but anything we take in, such as experience and movement and interactions and information, is associated with our quality of Agni, digestive fire, and quality of our metabolism, which is considered to directly influence our ability to break things down and to process them. And muscles play an essential role in metabolism. And this makes sense when we think about how costly muscle tissue is. So muscles consume fuel and transform something from one thing, right? They transform chemical energy into something else, into mechanical and thermal energy, just like fire. And so healthy muscle tissue and our overall quality of strength contributes greatly to our personal quality of Agni. And so if you are wanting to strengthen Agni, then you want to build muscle. Resting metabolic rate. So there's a concept called resting metabolic rate, and what that means is that is the total number of calories that you burn when your body is completely at rest. So when you're sleeping and you're not moving, you're still breathing and circulating blood, and your organs are functioning, and you have basic neurological functions, and all of this still consumes calories. And this, our resting metabolic rate is proportional to our lean body mass. And so our resting metabolic rate relates to our overall metabolism and therefore our Agni. So with more muscle mass, we consume more qualities at rest, right? Because muscle tissue is expensive. And this doesn't mean necessarily that more and more and more is better. You know, muscle is very expensive tissue, but Agni is essential for overall prana and apana balance, for that balance of prana and apana. So if, like I said before, if one's Agni is low, then muscle mass is a very important physiological piece to stimulate and to support. The other thing about muscles is that we understand more and more is that muscles are also very much an endocrine organ. And so before we talk about the 3 adaptations of the peripheral body, it's important to understand that current research has showed us that muscles contribute more than just strength to our body, but they play a really important role in the symphony of hormonal excretions such as cortisol, dopamine, serotonin, and melatonin. And they are huge contributors to longevity. And so building muscle tissue has essential health benefits beyond strength gains that really become more important as we age. So as we age, naturally motor units begin to drop off no matter what. We can build muscle as we age, but not at the same rate as when we were young. And this has been it has been shown that those who are past 65 years old with more muscle fall less, and if they do fall, they fracture less. And this has a lot to do with how muscles are involved in strengthening our bones. And bones, we're going to learn more about bones next, but we have something that's called bone muscle crosstalk. And so hormonal secretions from muscles don't just contribute to agni, but they're also really important in bone metabolism. We'll learn about that. And diseases that used to be seen as separate, such as sarcopenia, which is considered to be muscle loss, and osteoporosis, which is bone loss, are now spoken of as one disease, osteosarcopenia. And so one of the things that I think about for me to me, muscle is like, it's like currency as you get older and older. For those who, as we get older, our immune systems aren't as strong, many things aren't as strong. And so when we dip down in our health, that is like our health bank that we can really pull from. And for me now at 53, I train for the 60-year-old in me. That's how I see health and well-being. And it's, yes, I want to feel good now, and I really want to feel good then. So, okay, so let's talk about peripheral adaptations. So here we are talking about what happens with the tissue itself that we associate with strength, such as muscle, fascia, and tendons. So before we were talking about how the brain adapts. Now let's talk about how these tissues, what adaptations happen within them for strength. Okay, so first is hypertrophy. And as we remember, or well, I won't go there. Oop. Sorry. So hypertrophy. So when muscles pull, it creates mechanical tension. And as we learned, this happens at the level of the sarcomere. And so hypertrophy is an enlargement of tissue by increasing the size of its cells. So what we're looking at in this picture is a muscle cell. And within that muscle cell, we have these individual myofibrils. And myofibrils are composed of sarcomeres, the proteins, actin and myosin, that pull to create contraction, right? A chemical reaction happens and the actin and the myosin pull together, and that's what causes the muscle to contract. So how hypertrophy happens, which is the growth of muscle, is when tissue is stressed by mechanical load, the sarcomeres within the myofibrils begin to split due to metabolism into thinner sarcomeres. And then they chemically rebuild into thicker sarcomeres so that the myofibrils have more cross bridges. And so what is, we hear a lot is that we tear the muscle, right? And then it rebuilds. And that's not really quite true. It's this chemical reaction metabolic process that these cross bridges are torn, they're metabolized, and then they build to create more cross bridges. Okay, so the sarcomeres themselves become bigger. And so what we can say with hypertrophy and concentric contraction, here is someone who's done a lot of weight training and their muscles have gone through the process of hypertrophy, is that they have an increase in the cell size, right? They don't have more cells. It's just the cells themselves are bigger through that process. Okay. And so concentric contraction causes muscle size to grow in diameter. Eccentric contraction, so a lot of eccentric contraction, causes muscles to grow in length. So like a dancer, they have grown their muscles to look like this because of the experience of so much eccentric contraction. So hypertrophy is when you place the tissue under challenge and it metabolizes and reforms into thicker or longer contractile elements. And what causes this to happen is slow contraction that increases tension. And what I mean by that is moving slowly because you cannot move fast. And that would happen because the load you are moving at first is so heavy that you're unable to move it quickly. Right? We might not understand what this means in terms of a dancer. Like we see them at this one point where they've trained for so long, but there have been all of these adaptations over time that have allowed them to move at the speed that they move. But hypertrophy has to do with moderate to heavy loading between what we call 75 to 85% of 1 rep maximum. What that means, if you are at 75 to 85% of 1 rep max, that might mean that you can only move a weight that is where your 1 rep max might be, let's say 50 pounds. You can do it once and that's it. That's 1 rep max. So whatever 75% of that would be a 1 rep max, if that's what, 40 pounds. I don't know if I'm right about that. But that's what you're looking at. That's when you begin to get hypertrophy. And so the question that's good to ask yourself is that, are you doing anything in which you are moving slow because you can't move any faster? A really, common one would be like, I know all of us are doing chaturanga, right? It's very different to do chaturanga. Put my shirt off here, as you can see, it's very different. To So here, I got a lot of load coming in. It's very different. To do try running like that. To not resist, or to work through. And maybe this is as far as you get, and then you're down. But if you keep working it like that, then eventually you'll keep finding that ability to resist load, remaining fairly stable in that way. Make sense? Yeah, okay. Now, the other thing that's interesting about hypertrophy is that internal focus can really make a difference. And they found this to be true with weight training, because with internal focus, you can really then begin, just like I did there, to isolate what is really working, what's really moving. And again, that really ties into coordination and what is not moving. Okay, so a lot of people really equate hypertrophy with just like gaining bulk, bulking up, but everyone is going to look different based on genetics in terms of what happens with hypertrophy. And hypertrophy is really a measurement in strength gains. That's how you measure hypertrophy, your ability to move load. And muscle fatigue is different than neural drive. This is different than that neural drive perception. And this happens within the muscle itself. And what happens is that calcium ions and other metabolites that are used for muscle contraction within the mitochondria, as we work, muscles create contraction, and the calcium will continue to accumulate as the mitochondria begin to fatigue. And so depending on someone's conditioning, at some point, there's going to be a spike in calcium levels within the muscle. And when there's too much calcium in the muscle because the mitochondria cannot keep up with processing, there will be a reduction in mechanical tension. And this is when we've reached our max. All right. And this is something that we feel at the muscle. So when we contract against high resistance and then recruit more motor units, then the muscle is accustomed to being able to excite. The things that happen are that we shake. So you know that feeling? When you see somebody shaking and everybody says, that's good. It is good. In that you're trained, that is a adaptation that's showing that you are training more motor units to turn on and to activate, okay? And that is the indication of the first stage of muscle fatigue. And then the next stage are like spasms and cramps, and those aren't so good. So endurance training does not result in an increase in muscle size, but it can morphologically change the mitochondria within the muscle to produce more ATP. The opposite is true as well. And that has to do with muscles that are deprived of work will waste away and become inefficient and less easily excitable. And this is called atrophy. And so sedentary muscles have more connective tissue. Right here, we see a normally active muscle and a sedentary atrophied muscle. A normally active muscle is 96% myofibrils and 3% connective tissue. A sedentary muscle is 70% myofibrils, 25% connective tissue. And when muscles aren't regularly used, they tend to lose muscle fibers and are replaced by connective tissue. And the connective tissue just acts as structural support. But this then results in reduced muscle strength and flexibility. And this, of course, is associated with inactivity, can be associated with aging or with immobilization. And so what a lot of people may not realize is that if they're always staying below the threshold of muscle fatigue, then the adaptation of hypertrophy is not happening. So it's important to understand we're not just talking about bulking, but the stoking of full muscle metabolism, which strengthens our acne and our overall resilience. Okay, just a little bit more here. Let's talk about DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. So what is it? And we all have it that next day after you've worked hard and you're super sore, or the day after. The truth is it's a bit of a mystery. It's not totally understood, and it's different than muscle fatigue. And what we do know is that once you become accustomed to an exercise, you become less sore. And over time, you can still reach the same level of muscle fatigue within a specific area in training, but have less DOMS afterwards. And we have greater effects of soreness from eccentric contraction than we do concentric. And it peaks between 24 to 72 hours. And everyone seems to have a unique but consistent time frame for DOMS. I am 48 hours, highest point of DOMS, but everybody's different. Some people are 1 day after, 2 days, 3 days after. And at its peak, you might have a little less strength, but on the down slope, your strength returns. Okay, so here we're looking at a horizontal cut of a thigh. In the center, we see the femur bone, and then all the muscles within the thigh. And what I want you to just look at is that the white is the adipose tissue and the connective tissue, the myofascia, okay, surrounding the muscle. And then there's, of course, myofascia within the muscle. So the next concept has to do with what we call lateral force transmission. And here I'm just showing you some more, the myofascia that surrounds and is within the muscle. And we have something that is part of surrounds our sarcomeres and our myofibrils, and they're called costomeres. And they bind the sarcomeres to the fascia. And what this does is it causes the mechanical force that's generated by muscles longitudinally. Like we think of, we have these myofibrils, and when they contract in a longitudinal way. But what the costomeres do is they distribute force 3-dimensionally out into the system and into the fascia. Right? So it's not just this linear way that force is distributed, but it's also distributed out laterally into the fascia. And when we strengthen muscle, we're also strengthening costomeres and that ability of that longitudinal 3-dimensional force that happens. And the last thing we're going to talk about in terms of an adaptation is what's called tendon stiffness. And that sounds like a bad term to have tendon stiffness, but anatomically it's a positive thing to have tendon stiffness. And this is not referring to the range of motion in our tendons, but like this inherent quality within the tendon. And so tendon stiffness is a mechanical property that describes the amount of force needed to stretch a tendon by a certain distance. So increased stiffness impacts the ability of the muscle to rapidly generate force. And so we want, it's like a spring. That's why they use this image of the spring. When there is strong tendon stiffness, there's all this potential energy that exists within the tendon, and it can transfer force very quickly to the bone from the muscle. And so tendon stiffness means that a tendon has elastic recoil and more stored energy potential. Therefore, a stiffer tendon has more strength. And tendon stiffness increases through the stress of heavy loads between 80 to 90% 1 rep max. All right, so those are all the different adaptations that come together to increase what we would call measurable strength gains. And what's really important to understand when it comes to loading is very much, safe loading is very much a process of vinyasa krama, and that heavy loads are not something we jump into. And it's a step-by-step process with many small steps over time. Too quick and too fast, we can lack the adaptations to prepare for what we're asking the body for, and this can lead to injury. Right? So let's finish with the talking about the koshas. And so when it comes to where muscles fall into these layers of the self, we really look to the Manomaya kosha, the third sheath. So the first is the Annamaya kosha, the physical body. The second is the Pranamaya kosha, the pranic energetic body. And the third is the Manomaya kosha. They call this the emotional body in this slide, but we can also call it the lower mind. It's often referred to as the lower mind. And another way that it translates is to the body, which is made of our thought process. And so muscles, of course, are part of the Annamaya kosha, the physical body, but why we place sort of like the mind of the system in the Manomaya kosha relates to how the nervous system is in command of the muscular system. And the Manomaya kosha, or the lower mind, is responsible for sensory and motor activities. It processes information from our 5 senses and responds reflexively. The mental body determines literally how we move through life, which can either be on autopilot or actively and intentionally shaping our life through thoughtful action. The nervous system mediates the activity of the Manomaya kosha, expressing the commands through the physical body and the muscular system. Here is an example, like the koshas, in which that which is more subtle permeates and informs that which is more tangible and gross. The lower mind feeds on the sense impressions that we offer it. So if we supply our mind with violent TV or video games, for example, our mind begins to crave increasingly aggressive forms of stimulation and may become more agitated and less empathic. When we are overwhelmed with thoughts and worry, we can have mental indigestion, where we're unable to process and integrate information well. And worry and overwhelm directly affect our quality of Agni and hinder our metabolism and our ability to digest. And so this happens on all levels, physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. stress, such as mental and emotional worry and overwhelm, can stimulate our sympathetic nervous system. And when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, the primary chemical changes in the body include the release of norepinephrine from the nerve endings and epinephrine, adrenaline, from the adrenal medulla, leading to increases in heart rate, blood pressure, blood sugar levels, heightened alertness, and muscle tension, which are essentially preparing our body for fight or flight. And so without moving through that flood of biochemistry, like if you're just sitting at a desk and experiencing worry and overwhelm, and you don't have the opportunity to digest and move and run and process that biochemistry, we can be left feeling exhausted and uncomfortable in our muscles and our bodies. And if this becomes chronic, it becomes deleterious for both the body and the mind. It is said that the monomycosha shuts down daily when we sleep in an attempt to regenerate itself. That's why we can often just feel better in the morning, right? With a good night's sleep. And the health of the monomycosha is enhanced through focused mantra meditation. And so mantra meditation can soothe and help to the mind and help to sort of release energy knots that are tied up in mental complexes and obsessive thought. And regular practice of pratyahara, where like sense withdrawal, is also healing and regenerating for this level of the mental sheath. And so what we can say is that eccentric activity of our muscles extend us out into space and create spaciousness within. And concentric activity gives us a feeling of drawing into center and integration. And isometric contraction is our connection with stillness in the physical body, which really allows us to see our mind more clearly. And it's these different activities, right, found in balance and applied to asana, is the art of opposition of the muscular system, which creates this experience of blending into one. So that is the end of the lecture around strength and adaptations. I want to see, before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about Vinyasa Krama before we finish, but any questions or thoughts about any of that before we move on?
I have one. So the DOMS, the muscle soreness after working out, you said that they're not sure why that happens. Are there any hypotheses as to why?
There might be. I don't know them.
Okay.
I just know it's still pretty mysterious. Like
Hmm.
there's not, like the science isn't really well understood
Hmm.
to what's happening there. I know there's like this understanding around like the buildup of lactic acid, but
Mhm.
I don't know much more than that right now.
Okay. No worries. I'll look it up and I'll get back to you about that.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other thoughts, questions about that? No? Okay. All right. We are going to talk a little bit now about just sort of like these next thoughts around Vinyasa Krama. And I'm gonna just read some from the Vinyasa Krama 2 handout. But I guess my first question to everybody would be, was that Saturday class helpful for you with getting more clear around Vinyasa Krama
It-
or not?
It was clear for me, my partner, she like made sure, I think it was Mabel. Is that her?
Audrey,
Audrey, knew it was a C name, Mabel. Audrey, yeah, she made sure that we went over it and I had, just, we would correct each other and just go over it and over it and over it again, because she wanted to be sure she had it. So I thought that was very helpful.
okay, great.
Yeah.
So what we really looked at were kind of the basics of Purva Anga. That is the beginning of the practice, moving towards the goal pose. And so part of your homework is to, and when this will be due is our next in-person class at the end of January, is to refine it. Go back to what you've done with those pre practices and see, are there poses you would take out? Are there poses you would put in? Do you see what you have now any differently? Okay. And I want you to build it out a little more, where you can think more about like the simple ways that you might begin class and maybe some things that you would weave in to continue to build to that point. If you were making a 45-minute, if you're making a 60-minute class or 75-minute class, right? So if you're making a 60-minute class, you would be hitting your goal pose at around 40 to 45 minutes. And what's really, really important is that you're doing it. You have to get on your mat and feel this out. I don't want you to just think about it, because if you move with it, you'll see it and understand it so much differently. And you'll get so many more ideas too. Okay. But let's talk about we're going to talk about the second part, which is called Uttara Anga, because that's the second part of the homework and the newest part of the homework for you, which is compensation. Now, those last, 15, 20 minutes, and how you are bringing the body back to neutral. Okay, so I'm going to read this and then we can have some questions. So Uttara Anga is compensation, and compensation is just as essential as Purva Anga, as it returns the body to neutral. Uttara Anga, after the goal pose of the practice is reached, the body will have accumulated various stresses and patterns of movement that need to be neutralized by counter movement. The science of compensation is called pratikriya, which means to counteract. Each action we perform must be balanced relative to the degree of its frequency, intensity, complexity with its opposite. When compensating, both dynamic and static variation should be used, with dynamic variations preceding stillness. I'm going to stop there and talk about this idea of dynamic and static. Okay, so dynamic is moving in and out of a pose. And the reason we do that, oh, I got all blurry. Don't know why. Hold on. Okay. And do we have to do it with everything all the time? No, but it is a really intelligent way to prepare muscles concentrically and eccentrically around a joint for stillness. And it also helps to bring fluid into the joint. We'll learn more into the joints that are working. So here, would be a dynamic movement, right? Moving in and out, waking up, eccentric and concentric contraction before you come to hold a pose, right? And there's, do we have to do it with every single joint, every single time? No, not necessarily, but certainly the ones that become load bearing. And that can be very helpful. It really helps people to know where their bodies are in space too. And what is said is that dynamic movements are great for preparation, and holding poses is a place where we begin to see the mind more clearly. We can have more reflection in the moment in terms of our experience of Sthira Sukha, our quality of breath, how we're holding ourselves. Okay. So sorry, my thing, my handout's a little doesn't have numbers on it, so I'm getting confused about. Here we go. So let's talk about compensation. So compensation is a progression from challenge to equilibrium. And here are some general guidelines. Compensate for deep forward bends with gentle twists and simple strengthening backward bends whose range of motion is less than the deepest forward bend of the preceding series. Do not include extreme opposing actions in the same class. So that is really, really important in terms of creating balance in the body. We do not want to go from something like a deep forward bend and feel like we need to finish class with a full back bend. It's too stressful on the system. Okay. So do not move from a full forward bend like Paschimottanasana into a deep back bend like Urdhva Dhanurasana. From a forward bend, bring the spine back to neutral, strengthening it there, and then move easily into back bends like Shalabhasana, like locust, bridge, supported bridge, things like that. Okay, where you're gently opening the front of the body. Compensate for back bends with simple twists that soften the back, and gentle forward bends whose range of motion is less than the deepest back bend. Again, from deep back bend to simple twist, then to easy forward bend. And for inversions, you really want to soften the neck, the shoulders, because a lot of tension can accumulate in the arms, the shoulders, the neck. And then you proceed to bring the rest of the body back to neutral by compensating for the effects of the rest of the pose. So like if you were doing crow, then what kind of shape of pose is that? Is it a forward bend?
It's more of a, you're not back bending.
It's a forward bend. Your thighs are coming towards your torso. Your knees might be bent, but it's still a forward bend. Can you see that? And you're being pulled into flexion. And so from crow, you could finish with a supported bridge after you did some twists. Starting to make sense? Okay, so we have 13 minutes. Maybe I'll let you go before that, but let's think about some compensations. Throw out a goal pose and let's just think about what could be some appropriate compensations. Anybody?
A half moon.
Shavasana.
Okay, Shavasana is always a good compensation at the very end. That is neutral. All right, half moon. I like it. Okay. So, thoughts?
And your hips are adducted, so something that isn't that.
Okay, yeah, I would agree. So I think if you spend a lot of practice, sorry. Keep putting you guys like, if you spend a lot of practice like this, then it can feel really good at the end of practice to do this and to hug everything back into neutral. Make sense? Okay. So you're in adduction in that pose, but you're also in flexion here, right? And you've probably done a lot of flexion to get here. Wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Right. So that would be something else you would want to work out with some
Bridge.
hip extension. Sure. You could do bridge. Maybe
Supine twist. You could do, yeah.
you could do twist, but
Like no, like supine twist, right? Where your hips,
well,
where you're
supine
extending the
twist,
back.
you're still in flexion. So supine twist, I'm sure would feel good, but if we're really just trying to be very clear
Mhm.
about creating some neutrality into the
Mm.
joint that we have just worked, then in that bottom leg, we have a lot of flexion. And so we would want to find some extension. There's bridge. There's windshield wipe, right? Here, windshield wipe, I'm creating openness and extension around the front of the hip, right? And we've done it on both sides. So that would feel good. You could also maybe, this isn't commonly done at the end of a class, but you could, I don't know if you guys can see me here. Something like this, we're lifting the hip and opening it this way. You know, there's all different ways to find some gentle hip extension as you work your way back to neutral.
This might be a silly question
No
too,
silly
but if you're yes, true, thank you. If you're doing half moon, I assume you're gonna want like to do some shoulder because you're in, are you in extension here or flexion here?
You are in horizontal adduction. No, this would be horizontal adduction, but you're in adduction. So what
So
if
you'd want to do, I think I automatically go to like something opposing, where I'm,
yeah, so you could do something gently opposing.
yeah, okay.
Where
Or like eagle, but that's that might be too.
eagle is more complex
Mm-hmm.
and more extreme than this.
Like a
Right?
Sami
Right.
Stiti or something.